Very
So I always used to think that the phrase was like fragile eagles. Like you just have like a really fragile eagle. Can I start? We gotta start the show.
Okay. Sorry. Fragile eagle. Sorry.
Okay, stop it. You're getting me going. Okay, cool. Welcome to Zarnia for games and... Welcome to Zarnia for games and geekery. I'm here with Limpho Moeti. Limpho, how you doing?
I'm fantastic. How are you?
Cool. Limpho, you are a games producer, right?
I am.
Or have I gotten that totally wrong?
I am a games producer and I also do business development for them.
And business development.
Yeah.
Okay. So you work primarily in the indie space, is that correct?
Yes.
What company are you working with right now?
So at the moment, I'm working with a company called Nyamakop. They released a game called Semblance, and we're currently working on African-inspired games for a global audience.
Oh, that's very awesome. So Semblance, I've played. It's very fun, squishy puzzler.
Exactly. It's delightful. And it's the first game ever from Africa that made it onto a Nintendo console.
Okay, that's very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's on the Switch.
And then sometimes, like, when you're just like, when you discover one of these statistics, you're like, wait a minute.
How?
The first now?
It's very interesting. A lot of tech, like a lot of bigger tech companies are just not on the continent. So, for example, we can't get Stadia, the new sort of gaming platform, because Google in 2020 does not have any data centers on the continent of Africa.
Damn. Okay.
Yeah.
So
It's rough.
one of the things I wanted to chat to you about are kind of like the challenges of centering Africa in the realm of games, gaming, technology, and geekery. You know?
Yeah, I mean, it's really quite interesting because Africa, when it comes to tech, in a lot of ways, is still considered the dark continent to be explored and discovered. And I think that there is a persistent and annoying idea that Africa is 90% mud huts and giraffes, which is obviously not true.
Yeah. There are other animals other than giraffes.
Exactly. And so there isn't a lot of interest just yet on the continent, but slowly that's changing. So obviously we're working on a game that centers the continent and tells African stories. And just recently there was a game called The Ouagadougou Chronicles, which wanted to raise $100,000 on Kickstarter, and I think raised the money and more in like 5 days. They are an African fantasy MMORPG, and they have a D&D core rulebook. Not core rulebook, but they have a D&D...
Like expanded content so you can play in the setting, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah, I've read it. It is very, very cool, very interesting, cool. And so comprehensive. And it's like, I don't want to sound like I'm just advertising for them, but I can't believe that content is free. That book is free. You can just download it and you're like,
all
awesome.
of the monsters are based off African myths. A lot of the ways that they've done each class is based off different cultures, which is fantastic. And even outside of games and television shows and movies, there is a very obvious hunger for content coming from the continent.
I want to acknowledge that, and I also want to say history has basically been around an extractive relationship with Africa.
Yeah.
All right. How does it differ, like extracting now cultural capital from?
I think the big difference is that a lot of the creators are from the continent. So rather than just extracting culture, it's more like they're investing in the continent. So the money's making it into the hands of people on the continent that can help then drive the entertainment industries in each of those countries. I mean, I try obviously not to, it's very easy to say the continent, but there are like 54 countries. So it's also very country specific. But definitely within the sphere of video games, it's driving those industries. So, like, for example, the video game industry in South Africa is definitely going to improve greatly because we have investment rather than just cultural extraction. And a big thing is that there's always been a market for these kinds of games. Studies showed that African Americans, 77% of African Americans play video games, which is higher than other population groups in America, but they're just underserved. Yeah, it's ridiculous. It's like $3.6 billion that's just sitting on a table. So it's also that we're not making content. This sounds very uncomfortable to say it like this. We're not making content for the dominant groups in our society, but rather making content for African diaspora that can also still be enjoyed by anyone. And I think that change is happening all over.
Yeah, it's one of those things where just because you are making stuff that has a particular interest to a particular group doesn't mean that that excludes other groups.
Exactly. Everyone can play it if you want to.
Why are people so threatened when they hear that a material, like a product or a movement, wants to include a particular group?
I can talk about it from the geek sphere. I think it's because it feels like being a geek is like an integral part of your identity. And not in the last 20 years, if we're honest, but before then, you were bullied for being a geek. It felt like your thing. It is this thing that you could tie yourself to, that you loved, but you can't imagine other people having it. You know, it feels like it's yours. And as soon as you try to include other people, it feels like they're posers or they don't deserve it. They haven't gone through what you've gone through, even though they probably have. And so you don't want to share it because it feels like you're sharing a part of yourself versus being like, I love this thing. I want more people to be involved in it because then my thing can last forever. It's a thing of like, I think a lot of people see it as a pie. And for a long time, the whole pie was for them. And now it feels like only 2/3 or 8 out of 10 pieces are for them. And that's 2 pieces less than they had before, which is silly. Yeah, it's not a pie.
Yeah, it's a consumer like based perspective on the thing where we think that more people involved means like more of it is being eaten, but we don't also see that like more of it's being created.
Exactly, more of it's being created, more of it's being enjoyed, and a lot of geek consumer items are struggling. Comic books are struggling. Board games are not struggling, but I think it's very difficult to accept that not everything is for one group when everything has always been for that group. And so they don't need to know how to empathize or read stories from a different perspective because they never had to. But it's cool. It's interesting. It's new.
So, not to like say you're exceptional and special. I mean, you are.
I am.
You are. Dimple. You know what I'm saying. But as like a black woman who is a geek, a hardcore geek,
I'm a hardcore
like
geek.
You have your credentials are ironclad.
They're unassailable.
Unassailable.
How old am I now? I'm oh my God, I'm very old.
Don't say that on camera. It'll date the footage. Don't do it.
But I've been reading comic books for about 17 years. And I worked in a comic book store for 9 of those years on purpose. Like, I actively sought out a comic book store to work in because I loved nerd things. And I think that for the most part, it was generally lovely. Like, the people I worked with were great. Most of the clients were great. Some were a little bit creepy. Some were definitely racist. But on the whole, it was a really enjoyable experience. I think being a fan and knowing my stuff definitely helped. And it was very exciting towards the end of when I worked at the comic book store that there were more women, being highlighted in books and having their own books and being able to share that with a younger generation and get them into comic books like that. It made me very happy. I think it's a little bit difficult, a little bit harder working in an industry than maybe just consuming. So, I mean, for the most part, it's been great, but I have definitely noticed some difficulties because of my gender and my race. people don't expect me to like know these things, you know?
I have the opposite. People like think that I do, and I've got to admit that I'm just like, actually, I'm
You have no idea.
I'm a super fake geek, very fake geek.
To be fair, I only got into D&D like a few years ago. So.
Me too. Wait, strike that, editor. Cut that out. Cut it out, editor.
He's been in D&D forever. Don't worry, we'll fix it in post.
But you actually started playing D&D again, like with me.
Yeah, I did start playing again with you. You're a great DM.
Thanks.
It's a lot of fun. Didn't I like bully you into hosting a session?
Yeah, you did.
During lockdown?
Also, you were one of the biggest murder hobos I have ever come across.
No. That was not me. That was Kit. Kit started off that horrible trend.
Oh yeah, they kind of did, didn't they?
They did. It was Kit.
They just lopped the limbs off her,
oh my goodness.
of her poor...
And then I accidentally set the fields on fire. Anyway, as you can see, I am a seasoned D&D player.
Seasoned D&D. Great role player. Lots of murder.
Just...
Mwah, that good murder.
I'm less of a murder hobo these days. Because now I play electricity-based characters only. Lightning and thunder.
What do you think of the recent changes Wizards of the Coast have done to like the approach to diversity in D&D?
I think it's great. So I think... Because the thing is, Tell
me what the thing is.
The thing is...
This is the thing.
This is the thing.
Okay.
Because human beings are weird, right?
Yeah.
And so this idea that specific races could only ever really work with specific classes, I think subconsciously creates this idea of like which of the races in D&D are superior or not. So the fact that they're changing that, and instead of being like trying to create races that work particularly well with specific classes, they're opening it up. I think it's a great thing. It's very weird within fantasy how rigid the tropes are. I like to always joke that J.R.R. Tolkien broke fantasy when he wrote Lord of the Rings. I mean, he created it as well, but he broke it because it's very hard to move away from the idea of the high elf who is very magical and wise and ancient, and, you know, the knuckle dragging orc. Whereas I think this allows players a lot more freedom to play whatever the class they want with whatever race they want, and it doesn't have to be tied to particular stereotypes within the games, which bleeds out into how we see the world, right?
Yeah, I mean, like it's interesting.
Different races have different stereotypes.
Yeah, it's also interesting that you bring up like Tolkien as being a, you know, like because of what he said, it became like rigid, the high elf and the thing. But then you have like the second layer, like more layers being added onto it and added onto it. You know, like it gets etched deeper and deeper with each telling. So when you have the films coming out, of course the orcs are going to talk like this.
Exactly.
Oh yeah, with our deep voices and definitely like very classism there.
Exactly.
And the elves are going to have the
beautiful,
but the waves, yeah, exactly. The the class
like
will be embedded in there as well.
They're just born from money.
Yeah. Which is why it's weird. So often you kind of see like the high elves really being dunked on in like online D&D games. It's just like, oh, a high elf, they're the worst.
Exactly.
It's interesting.
They're the 1% of the D&D world. Of course, we need to dunk on them.
Oh yeah. Them. But I mean, part of it's also like the passion that people have for lore and creating lore. You know,
exactly.
And it's nice to have like the lore kind of like store bought off the shelf to delve into and get into.
I think that's very nice. But what I've definitely noticed with D&D is it lends itself very well to homebrewing, to really giving you the tools to create your own world and to create interesting settings. One of the games I played in recently, the homebrew is set in a Japanese fantasy setting, which is really interesting because, you know, they still use the stats from whatever monsters, but it's got that flavor text of coming from East Asia. And it's fascinating because you never really imagine fantasy in that setting often, or like the Wagadu Chronicles, we don't imagine fantasy in an African setting. It feels like it's very locked into Europe in the past. And I find it boring. I find it really boring. Like, I've seen it and it feels very gatekeeping that's the only way you can do fantasy, which is why you also then get a lot of pushback when you see a lot of people of color in fantastical settings, because by its very nature of where it's based on, it's actively locking more and more people out, which I think is silly.
I think that there is something there also to fantasy being bound up with our kind of foundational myths.
Yeah.
You know, a culture has a foundational myth. Britain's foundational myth kind of being King Arthur and that kind of fantasy setting. The US foundational myth for a long time being the Western, which has fallen out of the samurai film in Japan.
Yeah.
You know, what is essential to the culture.
Exactly. And I think it's just a little bit weird for me, sort of, that it feels that to tell a fantastical story, at least in the West, it always feels very tied to Europe. You know, Game of Thrones is like, is Europe. What's it? Middle Earth is Europe. Why? It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be. It may have been originally set there, but like, why does it need to remain there?
So now with like more people going in, what is there a danger of like another extractive relationship where people?
Yeah. I think there is. And I think it depends on the predatory nature of who's doing the extracting. Like if it's Disney, it's basically neo-colonialism, but I think it depends on each industry. Definitely from what I've seen with video games and how that model works, it's less extractive because a lot of the profit and money goes back to the company, goes back within the industry and can circulate, versus like a one-off payment and then they own your work forever. A lot of the IP often ends up remaining in the continent, even if an international company distributes it, which I think is a lot better.
We're talking about the diaspora being the market as well. Developing the local market is also vitally important.
It is.
How do we get more people in South Africa, in Africa in general, amped about geek culture, about D&D and comics?
I think they are amped. I think there's a lot of interest. I just don't think we know how to reach them, right? I think a big part of it is, at least in the South African industry, in the South African gaming industry, I think we look down on mobile games. I think we're a little bit pretentious like that. And I say we because me included, right? I acknowledge my pretentiousness.
Okay, yeah.
And there is a huge market in mobile games. Like the majority of Africans, more people have mobile phones than computers. So I think a lot of people are now interacting with content on their phones a lot more, which is quite interesting. And like they're playing a ton of mobile games, like hundreds of thousands of downloads. So it's just a question of like, are we creating stories that would be interesting to people on the continent? I think it's about, are we creating content that people on the continent are interested in? And it's very difficult to answer that question because, like I said, there are like 1 billion people here. So, I mean, particularly with the South African market, I think a part of the problem is that there is this idea that if something is made locally, it's not as good as something made overseas. And so usually you have to get the like stamp of approval from the West before South Africans will take you seriously, which is a shame. And I think in other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, it's just access. I mean, in Botswana, there are, I'm not kidding, metalhead cowboys. They have this huge metal scene. There's this huge scene for like goths in Botswana. But we don't necessarily know about that because we don't make that effort to research and to find those markets and how to really reach out to them, I think, because of the perception of like, Africans don't have money. Africans all live in townships, which is not true. There are tons of rich people on this continent. Are we doing all that we can to create inclusive spaces that geeks actively want to be involved in?
Are you saying build it and they will come?
Yes. Or at least make it a safe, inclusive, welcoming environment and they will come.
Yeah, okay. That makes absolute perfect sense. And it's also the only way to kind of get people to make art as well, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, Nyamakop has 90% of our studio is black. We are the first studio, I think, in South Africa that can say that. And a big part of that was actively making the effort to find the talent. Because it's there. It's always been there. I just think it's very easy to not do the work of looking. It's very easy to say, well, these people wouldn't fit into the culture. Or, you know, these people, whether that's queer people or women or people of color, whatever, aren't interested in these things. It's very easy to say that and then to not really question.
I've definitely been guilty of that.
Yeah. And not really question why more people from marginalized groups aren't actively involved in a space or a geekdom or an industry, as opposed to asking the question of, okay, but why aren't they interested? Are we creating things that they would want to be involved in? If they do want to be involved in it, are we making it easily accessible? Are we making it welcome? Are we actively reaching out to these communities to let them know that we exist?
Why do you think people should play D&D? Do you think people should play D&D?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I think people should play D&D because it is just a great way to make friends, to get really fantastic at scheduling, and to let your imagination run wild. I think the most fun you have with D&D is you can really feel like you're the Murderhobo sorceress who sets the fields on fire, and you can really build and create characters and explore them and really live them, because games can last a very long time. And I found that it's really helped with my creativity and kind of forced me back into that space of imagining things, maybe doing a little bit of writing. And it's just a ton of fun. Like, if you like the idea of being able to shoot lightning and thunder or fire from your hands or ice or acid, get into D&D. If you run around and smash things with a giant sword, get into D&D. It's a ton of fun.
There's so much like free content as well. Like the Wagadu Chronicles, like putting out this like whole smattering
There's
of stuff.
tons of free content.
You know,
it doesn't cost a lot of money. We've been playing online for ages. There, you can sign up for, I think it's Roll20. Don't even need to buy dice. You can just run an entire game on Roll20.
One of the nicest ways to play it in person, and you know, there's very little cost, and it's one of those things that actually everyone should be able to enjoy.
Everybody should be able to enjoy it, have a lot of fun.
So make it welcoming.
Exactly, make it welcoming.
All right, awesome. And on like the welcoming note, I'm going to say goodbye.
This is great.
And we're gonna wrap this up right here.
Right here.
Dimpho,
Thank you so much.
it is always lovely chatting to you. Thank you so much.
I really enjoyed this. I think I did not expect that I would be this serious in this chat. I thought I'd have way more jokes. I promise I'm very funny and charismatic usually. Thank you so much for having me.
We'll have to have you next time again then. Awesome. This has been Zarnia for Games and Geekery. This has been Limpho Moeti. Dimpho, where can people find games by Nyamakop?
They can find games by Nyamakop on Steam. They can find them on the Nintendo Switch. Really.
And where can they follow you?
And they can follow me on Twitter and on Instagram at just Dimpho. I think you're gonna have to put a little scroll.
Yeah.
Because I have a trap name. It's not spelled how it's pronounced.
Yeah, the L and the D.
Exactly. So look for just Dimpho with an L. I should actually really just Dimpho with an L. That's my whole thing. At just Dimpho on Twitter, on Instagram. You can add me on Facebook, but you'd just be sad. It's a lot of political ranting.
I mean, Facebook's sad. Don't go to Facebook. Stay away from Facebook. We're gonna go now.
Bye.
Bye.